Welcome to the Depot Museum. We are a 1912 Missouri Pacific depot that was turned into a museum in the late 70s. 1978 is when it became a museum. Prior to that, it served as a freight and passenger depot for Missouri Pacific and the Prescott and Northwestern railroads. Passenger service stopped in the 1940s and 1950s for those railroads. Freight continued until the late 1960s. Once freight service stopped, the depot was actually in danger of being torn down. But an effort by local citizens, the city saved it. And one person who was instrumental in that was John Teeter. He's actually the one who helped get the Chamber of Commerce moved into the building so that the building has a use. Now that didn't last long because we are right on the tracks and it's very noisy sometimes. But Mr. Teeter had kind of served as the first curator in that early version of the museum and made displays here, and that evolved into a full-blown museum in the late 1970s, and we've been here ever since, interpreting the history of Prescott and Ithaca County.
When was the depot built?
It was built in 1912, beginning in, I believe, about 1911. The Missouri Pacific Railroad went along their line, cuts diagonally through Arkansas, starting in Hope and going along the line all the way up to, I believe, Malvern. They began rebuilding their depots in those cities. This replaced an earlier 1870s building that was 2 blocks down. But what they did is they reconstructed their depots, made them of brick. This one is an interpretation of the Mediterranean style. We have a red clay roof. The bricks are from a commissary that Missouri Pacific specifically used only for their depots. So even if you could buy brick locally, they would have it shipped in from their brick commissary in Coffeyville. And so this was built on a similar plan to the depot in Hope, the one in Gurdon, all the way up to Malvern, as I said. The Gurdon depot and the depot here in Prescott are what I like to think of as sister depots. They're almost exactly the same blueprints. A couple of things that were changed at this depot, for instance, what would have been the freight platform on the west end of the building was enclosed to create an office at one point. It was an exact match to the passenger platform on the east side of the building, but that was enclosed at one point, which is now where we have our archive material.
So Missouri Pacific owned all those depots?
Yes, the Missouri Pacific, which is basically the inheritor of earlier railroads like the Cairo and Fulton Railroad, who actually built the lines into Arkansas through this area and created towns like Prescott. Prescott was actually established by the railroad that eventually became known as the Missouri Pacific in 1872. And towns like this were created specifically by the railroad so that they had a stop along that way. So they were a huge presence in these small towns along this route. And the train route that I'm talking about parallels Highway 67 from Little Rock to Texarkana. So if you travel along Highway 67 between those two cities, you're running parallel to the train tracks that the Missouri Pacific laid. And so these towns that you find along the way on Highway 67, many of them were created by the railroad and had a huge impact on their development well into the 40s and 50s. You start to see a decline in the presence of the railroad beginning in the 40s and the impact that it had on the cities, but this depot was a huge part of life in Prescott. And we hope continues to be because we preserve the history of the area and we share it here. But prior to that, it had a big economic impact as well as social and cultural. And so these depots were all constructed and owned by the Missouri Pacific. And this was, if you were traveling far distances, not everybody had a car back then, and part of this time was before cars was even available. So, the railroad was how you traveled. So being a stop on the railroad brought people to your town. And that might bring visitors who spent money, or that might bring new people who were moving in and creating businesses, living there. So that was very important. So that's why the Missouri Pacific was so important to the development of these towns, and these depots that they built were a big part of that.
Do you have a schedule when the train comes through, you know?
I don't keep a schedule here because it's all freight, but you know, when this was a working railroad depot, then yes, they would have had a full schedule of the trains coming through, particularly the passenger trains, but the freight trains as well. There would have been a full schedule, and they kept to that schedule. And you know, the passenger service along this route diminished greatly. I think there are 2 Amtrak trains that come through Prescott. They don't stop here anymore. They do stop in Arkadelphia and they stop in Hope, but they don't stop in Prescott anymore. But those 2 passenger trains, one comes in early in the morning, one comes in at late at night, going in different directions. So, but you know, back when this depot was built, those passenger trains, there would have been several per day. And that was your common mode of travel between along longer distances. Now, obviously, if you were just traveling maybe to the next town over, you might not get on the train to do that unless you wanted to go and be back in the same day. You probably would take your wagon or buggy. But if you were going to Little Rock, that was quite a trip back then. You know, nowadays it doesn't take as long in a car. So you can get to Little Rock and back in a day in a car, but you couldn't do that in a wagon. So that's when you would hop on the train.
Where were people going or coming from?
Now, if you were getting on the train here in Prescott, if you were riding the Missouri Pacific route, you would have been going to Little Rock, St. Louis. It went all the way up to, and it still does go all the way up to Chicago, and then you would probably change trains at that point to go to other destinations. But going southwest, you could stop in Hope, you could stop in Texarkana, go beyond that. The train route went down through Tyler, Longview, and I believe all the way to San Antonio before you had to change trains. But you could also get on the Prescott Northwestern Railroad. That was a railroad created in 1891 here in Prescott. And it was mainly created to be a way to haul lumber from the Ozan lumber yards in Pike County all the way back into Prescott, or to the sawmills closer to Prescott. So its original purpose was just for the lumber company, but it also took passengers. So if you took the Prescott and Northwestern, you could go along that line and stop at a lot of little communities, such as Tokyo. You could stop at, I think the last stop on that route was a small town called Daisy. So there were stops along that way. Arcadia was a stop, and they took passengers once a week on Fridays. And there was a time when the Prescott Northwestern, one of the things they hauled were agricultural products later on. And that railroad was the main way that they got peaches from the Alberta peach fields and got them back and transferred those to the Missouri Pacific freight cars and then shipped out throughout the country. And in the 30s and 40s in particular, those peaches were very well known nationally. Those were very sought after. So that helped the economy of this area too, but that was a second railroad that you could ride. It didn't go as far, it was just that specific length. I believe it was 147 miles. That was the length of that railroad back and forth. And passenger service with the Prescott Northwestern actually stopped in 1945-46.
Were there separate waiting rooms or?
There would have been in the original history of the building, so back in 1912 when it was built. This actually, the room behind you, was the waiting area for African Americans, and this was the white waiting area. So when you look in both of these rooms now, there were 4 restrooms in the building. There were 2 in the white waiting area for men and women, and 2 in the African American waiting area for men and women. And the bathrooms in that area are now closets, but you can still see on the door where it says men and women on it. But they, early on, yes, the train cars would have been segregated, and the waiting rooms were segregated as well.
Mm-hmm. What are some of your favorite parts of that?
I have several pieces that I personally like the most, and if you want to come in here and I can actually point out one that's on display. It doesn't look terribly impressive until you know what it is. This is the tip of a dugout canoe, most likely Caddo, and the Caddo were the indigenous population that inhabited this area. The Caddo and the Quapaw were really central and southwestern Arkansas. Now, the tip of this canoe was found in the banks, sticking out of the banks of the Little Missouri River. Their canoes were very long. This canoe was probably about as long as this room. And they were very narrow. They would take, the Caddo would take logs and hollow them out to create these canoes. And there have been several found around the state of Arkansas that are still preserved very well because the mud kind of preserved the wood. And this was donated to us by the Van Deaver family, and it's just beautiful. And so that's one of my favorite pieces right there. Now, so this is part of a window sill, and this was from the first county jail. This was the window sill. Now you'll notice all of the nails hammered into it. That's because the county jail was a wooden building, and it really was possible to take a saw and just saw through the windowsill and get those bars out and help someone escape. So they ran nails, they hammered nails into the windowsill so that you couldn't saw through it. It would break the saw. So that was a preventative measure. That was to keep people from escaping. So I think that's a wonderful piece of our very early county history. And then finally, another piece. This is one of the early signal lamps from the railroad. If you look at train crossings now, you'll see electric signal lights that look very much like our stoplights at traffic intersections. But these signal lights are very important for safety. This is how they signaled ahead to make sure that everything ran smoothly on the tracks, and that trains knew that there was another train coming, they needed to stop, they were switching tracks, all these things. You use signals for that. And they still use light signals on the tracks, but now they are electric and actually incorporated into the construction there, so you don't have people who are physically, manually signaling like you would have back in the early days of the railroad.
Okay, now, what were you saying about this?
I'm going to wait till that truck passes because it's going to get loud in a second.
Yeah.
That's the drawback between the train tracks and the highway. Now, this is, I think, our most popular item that people come to see. It's the Prescott and Northwestern caboose. It was constructed here in Prescott in 1920 for the Prescott and Northwestern Railroad. And of course, the caboose was on the end of the train. And part of the purpose was to help monitor the train. So you can see that there's that little tower on top, which is really called a cupola. The brakeman is the person who lived and worked on the caboose, and it does have living quarters. When you were in the caboose, you were probably going to live there for a little bit. But he would sit up in that cupola, and you could monitor the tracks, you could monitor the train and the surroundings while it was in motion. So that was part of what his job was. And then, of course, as brakeman, he was literally one of the people who helped stop the train. So multi-purposes there, but this particular caboose, remember I said they would take passengers as well. So there are, on one end, there are benches for the passengers to sit on. So they would ride on the caboose. We can go in and look at it. So this is the caboose. And at this end, we have the little desk that the brakeman would have used. And it could have been obviously used by other railroad employees. And the benches here, you can see that they have storage. Above you, you'll see the red bar I don't know if you've ever been on the back of a train when it's in motion, but it sways horribly. So that was necessary just to be able to walk while the train was in motion. And then right behind you there is the original heating stove, which could also be used for cooking. And it probably was wood burning at first, but they eventually transitioned to heating oil. But that was how they kept it warm. And it does have a chimney that goes right through the roof, so it has a little chimney at the top next to the cupola. Now, as you go forward, that's the cupola area. And then you can look up into the cupola and see what I mean about that. That's where he would sit to monitor the train. And he could sit in any one of those corners and get a 365 view. And then, again, more storage. And then straight on through, that's the bathroom and the kitchen. Those are like what I call the living quarters part. Now, the cupola here, there are panels that he would put out over this walkway, over the top, and that's where he would sleep.
Up there?
Uh-huh. You can see that there are some panels to the left, and they were laid out across these benches over the walkway so that there was a sleeping platform.
This area here,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
and what's the little gauge there?
Oh, that is for one of the steam brakes. If you look up to the left, you can see the valve control there. Now, this was the kitchen and bathroom. And this was actually an ice box right here. This sink had a space for a tank that you could fill at the stops. You would fill it with water, and then it would drain off into this. Both of these have drains that go right through the floor, so it would drain out onto the tracks. Now, where you're standing is the shower stall. And if you look down, you can kind of see the outline of where the shower stall was, and the drain, again. And that one is big enough that if you look down the hole, you can see all the way down to the ground. And it's kind of impressive. And it drained out onto the tracks, too. Now, one of the realities of train travel, particularly in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century, is that the toilets were the same way. This is sort of like a camp toilet, and this restoration is still a work in progress, so this doesn't look as nice as it could. But the toilet there also drained right out onto the tracks. There was not a collection tank like you find in an RV. It drained right out onto the tracks. So there were laws in place that made it illegal to use the restrooms on a train if you were within a certain distance of the city limits of a town. And that was to keep the waste out of the city. So if you lived in the country near the train tracks, there might be a mess that you got to smell all the time. But this is, like I said, this is the ice box. So it's lined in to keep it cooler. And literally you put a block of ice in here, and that's what kept your food from spoiling. So this really was a tiny home. You know, there's a fad for tiny homes on wheels now, and this was the original. And it also had electricity. Now, we have it hooked up to the city electric, but lights like this would have been on it in the first place because it had a generator. The generator was attached to a flywheel that was attached to the axle on the wheels below us. And this is part of that generator. It's not a complete setup anymore. But you can see that there is a belt that goes through the floor. That attaches to the train wheels. So when the train was in motion, it generated electricity. Now, it didn't have a battery set up, so you only had electricity when the car was in motion. But I have to say, this car, it was built in 1920, and it had electricity before some of the homes in Prescott did. So it was a little bit on the front end of technology being available.
Okay. And what are the hatches on the benches?
That's storage, and you can literally use it for anything. But I think it's likely that the passengers often would put like bags that they brought with them into that as well.
Instead of overhead storage.
Right, there's not any overhead storage, exactly. And you didn't have to like keep it right in front of you or anything like that. So, you know, and I don't know that this happened, but I kind of theorized that this red bar If they had quite a few people who were traveling on it, they could have stood and held on to the bar as part of the trip. That would have been very difficult, though, with the way it sways. So
Because it was at the end of the train.
and trains back then swayed anyway, but at the very back of the train, it would have been the worst. So yeah, it would have been very difficult to stay on your feet unless you were used to it.
How did the railroad play in the war?
The railroad was important to actually transporting troops. There were places that if you were drafted or if you joined up, you were sent to specific places to get on the train and go to your training facility. And a lot of those troops would have gotten on various trains in Arkansas and ended up coming along the tracks where we are now. And of course, quite a few men would have gotten on that train here in Prescott. But the railroad did play a huge part in transporting troops, both during World War I and II, and even Korea. So it was, the major public transport at that time. Commercial planes were not as frequently used during World War II and during Korea, but you didn't fly at that time the way we do now. It was the train. You took the train. So trains were how they transported the troops across the country and brought them back after the war. If someone was coming back home from the war, you usually met them at the train station with a big group to welcome them home. So that again played a big part.
You said that train was the main form of transportation. People didn't have cars. So how did they arrive to catch the train? Was there like a parking area for wagons?
Everybody having a car is a pretty recent thing. That's post-World War II. So even into the 20s, people were driving wagons into town when they needed to come into town. And they did have wagon parking areas. They were called wagon yards. And that's where you would leave your wagon while you were here in town. Now, you could pull right up, for instance, if you were shopping, you could go to the store, hardware store, whatever, grocery store, whatever store you were shopping at, you could pull right up in front, and that way you could get your goods put into the wagon. So you could park on the street, but most people left their wagon in the wagon yard. And that's literally what it was, just a place to park your wagon. So like our parking lots today for cars, but it was not paved in any way, and you really wouldn't have wanted it to be paved because there were horses there too. So if you were going to stay the night, though, you would actually put your horse in a livery stable, which would be the equivalent of a parking garage. And that's one thing about railroad towns. All railroad towns had several hotels. That was one of the first businesses that would pop up when a railroad created a town. Railroads generally were invested in getting hotels created as well. Sometimes they built the hotel themselves, sometimes they were partners, or sometimes they weren't, but there were always hotels. And you also see doctors moving into railroad towns very quickly because they were brought in by the railroad. The railroad needed good health care for their employees. And again, some of those hotels often cater to railroad employees. So it all kind of worked together. For a town the size Prescott is, we had an unusually high percentage of doctors. And not just general physicians, but specialists, like dentists. And because they were not only serving the permanent residents of Prescott and Nevada County, but also they were tending to those railroad employees who were mobile. They were traveling between all these different stops. And we have this wonderful exhibit. A lot of the pieces are from Dr. Hairston's. He was actually one of the last physicians who made house calls. And that continued well into the 20th century. But because the doctor in a small community, especially in the mid to late 19th century and early 19th century, he was not just the general practice doctor. He would have to know how to do surgery. He would have to know how to mix up his own drugs, so he was the pharmacist. And those were travel kits. You'll notice that it's in a little clamp case, so he could close that up and bring it with him. It would go in a saddlebag. So when he rode out to tend to someone who was sick, he could mix the medicine on the spot and leave it with the patient. So that was so common at that time, and it's very uncommon now.
Which one is that?
Old Mike was someone he got off the train one day in 1911, and nobody knew who he was, and he passed away. They think he had either a stroke or a heart attack, and he passed away. But nobody knew who he was. He didn't have any identification. So after he was embalmed, they put him in a coffin and sat him up in the window of the funeral home, which was not uncommon at that time, because if you had someone who nobody knew who they were, that was how you actually helped identify people. And because, if a loved one started looking for someone who was missing, they would actually think to do that, go to funeral homes and undertakers and look at unidentified bodies. Now the problem is that no one ever came for Old Mike. People came looking for their loved ones, nobody ever identified him, so he stayed on display like that for 64 years. So he died in 1911, but he wasn't buried until 1975, and he's buried in Deanne Cemetery. There's a portrait of Mr. Teeter on the wall, and he was something of a Renaissance man. He had a lot of different careers over the course of his lifetime, and he was really the force behind turning this into a museum. And he was also one of those people instrumental in saving the building in the first place. And he went through and collected a lot of the material that we had. One thing that I find particularly interesting is that he was a local weatherman. So he had all of his gauges and hygrometers and things like that, all of which are operational. So they have to be calibrated frequently. Now, my favorite piece is the portrait of Mr. Teeter you see on the wall here next to the cabinet. That was done by Spot Daniel, who received state recognition as what's called an outsider artist. He was a self-taught artist who did not start painting until he was in his 60s. But one thing Spot Daniel was known for is painting on anything. This is a scrap of wood that he painted on, and he would paint on cardboard, just about anything. So this is a fan he painted, and again, his signature there. And he had a very distinctive way of painting the Arkansas Razorback. And I think that's the most popular image that he did that people always want to collect, and we're very happy to have two of those. Now this is our display on Governor Thomas McRae. He was governor in the early 1920s, governor of Arkansas. Actually, his career started here in Prescott. When Nevada County was first formed in 1871, Governor McRae was then just a young lawyer. So he moved to what was then the county seat, Ralston. And when the county seat moved to Prescott in 1877, Mr. McRae moved to Prescott because his legal career, of course, you want to be where the court is, and the court had been moved to Prescott. And from there, he started his political career. He served in the legislature in the 1880s. And then after that, he eventually ran for governor and was successful. And he was governor during the time the Bankhead Highway was being established. And that was one of the first interstate car routes to go from coast to coast. And Governor McRae was instrumental in getting part of that route to come through Arkansas. And the Bankhead, here in Prescott, the Bankhead Highway is now Highway 67. It's the same route. But I can't emphasize enough how important that Bankhead Highway was to the development of Arkansas, particularly southwest Arkansas, because it runs right through here. Mm-hmm. And it brought people to this part of the state. He was very much part of the Good Roads movement at that time. More and more people were getting automobiles and wanting to travel, but there weren't that many good roads that led from state to state. So that's what that whole movement was about. And that was one of his priorities when he was governor. This is the kind of safe that, now this one is a York safe from 1910, And let me see, I think this was from the Scott store here in Prescott. But this is the kind of safe you would have found in most businesses at that time. And it looks like it's a very large safe that would hold a lot, but typically the doors are very thick, the walls are very thick. These were supposed to be dynamite proof. So if someone wanted to steal your money, they would often use dynamite to blow open your safe. So safe companies made them dynamite proof by making them extra thick. So there's probably only about a 2-foot square section in here that would hold money or whatever you wanted to put in it, and the rest of that is just solid metal so that your stuff was safe. And it's also fireproof.
And the phones?
This would have been a phone that if you had one in your office or business, this is the kind you would have. And early phone lines in Prescott were established as early as the 1880s, but it wasn't a citywide phone service. Businessmen would have a phone line set up between their business and their home, so between their office and their home, so that they could call their office for home or vice versa. So this is the kind of thing that they would have had. And the way it worked is, you'll notice that there's no way to dial a number. You contacted the switchboard that this was hooked up to. The way to do that would be to tap on the hook here until you got the attention of an operator who was physically at a board that had all of these switches and long cords, and they would physically plug your line into someone else's line, and that's how you were connected. So this was this was the earpiece, this was the mouthpiece. It is missing the little bell part, but that's how you talk. Now, it didn't take very long to get units like this. You would have found dial phones as early as the 20s. You could still get the operator by dialing 0, and that's not really necessary today. But back then, there might be times when you needed to be connected and you didn't know a number, so you could call the operator and they could help you out with that. But phone numbers back then were often 2, 3, 4 digits. It depended on how many people in your community had a phone as to how many digits your phone number was. And you had to actually wait for the dial to complete before you did the next number. So if you dial a modern number, which is, nowadays that's like 10 digits, even if you're calling in town. So you have to wait for that to go back around. So it can take a while to dial, but these still work. I have plugged these into our phone line and let kids dial their mom's cell phone, and it works fine. So this still actually works.
So what is the future of these depots?
Well, we're excited about the future. We kind of gradually become not just a museum, but Prescott Welcome Center. Mm-hmm. So people traveling along 67 or I-30, this is a place they can stop and get travel information, learn about Prescott. We have Prescott city guides that we give out and things like that, so people know what they can do here in Prescott. So that's one of the long-range plans for the depot building. And here at the depot also, in addition to expanding our exhibits, so we have more out on display at any given time, we're working towards having regular programming and also foster a spirit of preserving this history locally through preserving sites and buildings that are still standing, and how that can be achieved.
It's not a WPA building.
Not this one, no. There were WPA projects in Nevada County. This was specifically built by the railroad for the railroad. Their objective was to have a more modern depot and to replace the 1870s depot that was originally here. So, and of course, they never changed this building, so it's not modern now, but at that time, they were looking to upgrade their depots for passengers in particular, so that it had an expanded passenger platform and things. But this was always a privately built by a company, which was the Missouri Pacific at the time. Of course, Missouri Pacific had their own brick source. They had their own material sources for building these buildings, so that kept some of the costs down because they were providing it to themselves. So, but it would have been a few $100,000.
And the bricks there on the walkway, are those?
Yeah, those are original, and you'll notice that some of them are stamped Coffeyville. That's where they were made. So, and that was one of the brick foundries that the Missouri Pacific used. So, yeah, and the walkway and the platforms, all of that brickwork, that's the original. So that's been here since 1912 as well. So, yeah, not even the walkways are different.